but I mean, that's, a lot of the things she says. I think, there's more things that I could say. Obviously, she's stuck because she only has that much book. However, well, I guess you all heard the news. The Los Angeles Dodgers won the pennant. So that's fun. Let me get back to work here. Theoretically, we have work to do. Because today we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill. But as usual, there's leftovers from talking about Hegel that we haven't really talked about. I guess I could even go and just double check here. I mentioned the time he spent in Tübingen, especially with his roommates. Friedrich Holderlein, his first name isn't really Friedrich, that was like his third name or something, but for some reason that's what everyone calls him. And Friedrich Schelling mentions some of his publications, his time as after Napoleon kind of ruined the University of Vienna, he ended up working as a publisher for a newspaper. And then he ended up getting a job, thanks to his network of friends, as the head of a gymnasium, which was essentially a high school, equivalent of a high school, basically. And he continued to publish. He published his Science of Logic there. It's kind of interesting in the United States. There's kind of a cultural thing that his main book was The Phenomenology of Spirit, which I talked a little bit about. But in Europe, they think of his main book as The Science of Logic. And that's, of course, where he really expands on the idea of the dialectic, and famously talks about the very beginning where you start off with being and nothingness. And between the two of them, you get small being, capital B's. It's kind of interesting. But there's a constant repetition of threes. It's like he keeps trying to put things into threes. The thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's a threesome. And gets lost eventually because he gets to the point where he's kind of finished describing the history up to now, but then he can't really come up with the future. And in fact, as a comparison to Karl Marx, who did think you could predict the future based on the dialectical swing of things, Hegel never thought you could predict the future. Although, as I mentioned, his general meta-narrative, or the storyline he uses, is the progress idea. God bless you.
Thank you for going into the image.
And the idea of progress is towards more freedom, which, by the way, was demonstrated again last night. If you think of it, this is a pendulum that we've seen very physically in our own government, as it just keeps swinging back and forth from, seemingly one side to another. But for Hegel, it keeps moving towards a better and better future. So that's interesting to think of it that way. And for him, the thing is freedom. And what's he mean by that? Well, more freedom, in his philosophy of history, which is published. These are lectures that he gave when he was a professor in Berlin, but before he died, and they were published as notes. So if you look at a lot of the books that are published by Hegel, they're actually written by students listening to his lectures. And in fact, there's usually like maybe even 3 or 4 different students whose notes are kind of combined. It makes a really messy book. So if you look at his like lectures on religion, you end up with, one student has this, and another student has this, footnotes telling you, well, we've kind of combined these notes and these notes. But in any case, the narrative moves towards more freedom. So if you think of, the beginnings of time, no one really had freedom, and then, you have a tyrant ruling a whole country, and that tyrant has freedom, but none of his people do. Then you see the Rome, or Greek or Roman, where you've got more individuals. The people in Athens had some freedom, to vote on things. In Rome, you had the Senate; they had freedom, but you don't have freedom among all the citizens of Rome, right? And then you move on to Jesus, and really Jesus, in a sense, adds more freedom, because now you each can connect to God. Prior to Jesus, God was like a great big, monstrous thing that, you just wanted to make sure you stayed out of the way of it, so that it didn't crush you. But thanks to Jesus and the Revelation narrative, you end up now thinking that God and you have an intimate connection, where you're literally able to interact with God. And so as a result, there's more freedom from that point on, and so on. So in general, you get more and more freedom. Governments tend to change, giving people more and more freedom. Sometimes there's a reversal, and we've seen that too. But in general, it seems like the future tends towards justice, or tends towards freedom. And what's interesting, if clearly Hegel doesn't think about this at all, as far as I've seen. But when we talk about contemporary points of view, there's, I don't think I've mentioned this one before, Into the Cool. This is a book, if you're familiar with Carl Sagan and his Cosmos TV series, which has been recently, not too recently, but they redid it. In fact, Carl Sagan's wife was the producer, I think, of the new updated version of Cosmos. And Neil deGrasse Tyson was the narrator for the series, and I loved his spaceship. Well, never mind. But in any case, this is by Dorian Sagan, who is the son of Carl, and it's titled Into the Cool, and it's all about physics, and that essentially the laws of thermodynamics, if they're being followed, and actually they're quite complex thanks to this, but you think life is fighting against entropy. Entropy is the tendency for everything to fall apart, to enter into a chaotic collapse of the system, right? That's actually the second law of thermodynamics, that everything essentially tends towards the cool, right? Because instead of a hot, complex, interrelated system, it begins to cool down, and everything kind of falls apart. Kind of like the roulette wheel. As it's spinning, the ball stays, in the periphery, but as it starts to slow down, the ball starts hopping all around. So entropy. It seems like everything is essentially falling apart, and you think, well, but life fights against that, because, species are organized in such a way that they tend to continue. They don't collapse and fall apart completely, at least. The neat thing about this book is in an analysis of our input into the universe, it seems that we keep developing more and more technologies that essentially enable us to destroy the universe faster. So if you look at the global warming and everything, what have we essentially done? We've increased the entropy of the Earth by having all of these devices and things that we've created to use up the heat faster, essentially, right? So it's really fascinating, and so it actually ties into human freedom, because the more human freedom we have, the more we speed up entropy.
What's the antithesis of entropy?
Well, there's no thermodynamic laws that say everything has to stay together. It's the thesis that you could actually create a infinite machine, that conserves energy. The conservation of energy, I guess, would be the closest thing I could think of to the antithesis of entropy. But yeah, the idea that a system would stay, like a clock and not run down, that would be, I guess, the antithesis of it. But so we're, in a sense, thanks to this, the Hegelian thesis that we're increasing in freedom is actually entropy. I just think that's fascinating. By the way, Hegel also did not talk about biological evolution, even though the narrative in general is organic and changing, right? So that's the dynamic is changing. And of course, in the phenomenology, we talk about self-consciousness. Notice he dies in 1831. 1833 is when Charles Darwin was on the Beagle, learning about the things in the islands, the Galapagos Islands, and turtles and the finches, all the different beaks and everything. Is 22 on the Beagle, as I recall, Charles Darwin. So, famous quote everyone should know. It's not like Locke's tabula rasa, or Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short, or dog-eat-dog world. But for Hegel, the rational is the real, and the real is the rational. And what the heck does that mean? It sounds bogus, but essentially it's kind of a summation of the idea that everything that is our reality is socially constructed. If you think of it this way, I mean, even the objects that are hard and are obviously resistant to our desire to. I want it to be green. No, it's still. What an ugly color, and it's falling apart, and stuff. So there's aspects of reality that we call them reality because they're resistant to our desire to make. One of my favorites is when we talk about the three waves of feminism. The first one was the one that got the vote for women. That was a success, and everyone who was happy with that basically finished up pretty much, I guess. We read about their success, and that's the end of that.
Remember the suffrage?
Yes.
So the first wave is when
Women's suffrage.
we could all vote, and then everything was fixed because we could vote.
Yeah, because women would get a vote, and that means that they would elect Harris. No, it obviously didn't happen, as far as I can tell. In fact, I think she's going to be giving her concession speech in 15 minutes. So.
Are we going to watch it?
Pardon?
Are we going to watch it?
I'm going to watch it when I get home. Well, I'm being paid to do this. I'm supposed to actually give you, a certain amount of material here, and we're not there yet.
I remember watching the OJ trial in third grade. That is the only thing I remember.
I still remember the dancing Itos. Jay Leno had these individuals that dressed as Judge Ito. It was like about 10 of them, and they came on in the robes but with no pants, and they did a dance, and was ridiculous. But the rational is the real, and the real is the rational. What is real is this socially constructed reality, essentially. It's the updated way of saying it. But the feminists, they went on to the second wave, which occurred while I was in college, and I remember being at different rallies, I guess you would call them, not really protests,